Here we go. Chapter 2, Rene of Ren the Arrival, available on Amazon through my website, theinkcrusader.com. I'm Christina Garcia, the author of this suspense novel, is what one of the readers told me recently. So, here we go. Divine powers, what could that possibly mean? They all thought that night as they explained to Maria what just happened there on the patio. Well, she's a gift from an angel, Javier assured his family aloud. And divine is of God or goodness, so there's that, Julia expressed as she gazed down, smiling with pride at the baby in her arms, caressing her cheek and adjusting the blanket to keep her warm. Well, until you figure it out, raising this baby in a public hotel may not have the privacy you might need. Powers or no powers. Powers or no powers. You need time alone with her. Go to my father's house in Cordoba. You know, it's been a while since it's been used, Maria recommended. See, Mama, that is true. We will go right away, and I will return to settle things here in a couple of days, Javier immediately agreed. I know you're Senor World Traveler, mijo, with all your books and your stories, but I'm your mother still. I will take care of things here. Your brothers will help me. God knows Tomas needs to stop chasing different girls. He can do more, she said, shaking her head in disapproval. Take all the time you need, she insisted. The new parents then packed up their necessities and headed into the night for Casita Feliz. It was along the ride to Cordoba that the couple decided her name. Or was it maybe they were told her name? The wagon ride was bumpy, and the little Ren was there for the journey, tweeting away in the cage seated next to Julia. Oh, now you're speaking, chica? Javier questioned the bird. You were so quiet the whole ride to Mexico, and now you have something to say? Then looking over at his wife, he added, you think she knows the baby is here? Javier asked Julia with a laugh. That's silly, Javi. But hey, after what happened tonight, why doubt anything, she joked back. The little wren, still chirping loudly from under the cloth that covered its cage, was now a chatterbox. Julia became concerned for the bird since the baby was snoozing away, looking angelic. She peeked under the cloth to take a look at the wren, when the bird then flew right at their side of the cage as if to get a closer look at the baby in her arms. It was odd she didn't fly away in fear as expected. Clinging to the bars of the cage with its little feet, its little eye was rapidly observing the baby with its head tilted as it stopped tweeting. Chica is studying the baby. Maybe she wanted to take a look at her new friend, Julia called out to Javier, who was focused on the dark road ahead. Javier just chuckled. What kind of bird was this you said again? Julia said, slightly inspired. A wren, Javier reminded her. A wren, Julia softly repeated. Wren. Hey, Julia mumbled in thought as names for the baby were tumbling through her head as the wagon wheels jumbled along the road. Who's Rene, amor? Javier questioned, immediately tilting his head backwards towards Julia to hear her better. I didn't say Rene, Javi, she replied. Just then, the baby's eyes opened. The little bird began chirping again. This was the first time Julia had seen her daughter's eyes since her arrival. Tiny eyelashes had only been twitching about between her closed eyelids that night. They were hazel and just as bright as the angels that gifted her to them. Rene? Julia repeated, looking down at the little girl, dropping the cloth that covered the birdcage. The baby's eyes met hers, and she smiled. Julia got chills down her spine, and the hairs on the back of her neck stood up underneath her thick hair. The baby girl then stretched out her arms over her head, yawned, and brought her hands together across her chest, smiling again. Amor, who's Rene? Javier asked again, looking back at his wife in the wagon. Julia looked at him in shock. Javier's head kept looking back and forth between her and the road ahead. He then stopped the carriage and waited for a response. Amor? He said again gently. Our daughter, Julia said as she looked up from the baby again. I think her name is Rene. I had a cousin named Rene. He was a good man. But hey, I heard of women that have that name at church too, Javier assured his wife with a smile. It was like she heard her name and woke up, Julia said in disbelief, looking down at the baby. Javier then gave it a try. Rene, is that you? Little Rene looked at her father and smiled. Javier then reached down and caressed his daughter's face and greeted her. Hello, Rene, my little reina. Rene then smiled, slowly blinked her eyes. I thought I was your reina, Julia teased, looking over at her husband. You are my queen, amor. She's just a little one. Javier laughed as he turned back to get the horses started up again. Hiya, he hollered. Just then, the little bird covered in its cage started tweeting again. Okay, you're reina too, Javier called out to the bird. Oh, Javier, a true gentleman. But really, maybe Chica can be named Reina, Julia said. Okay, now, what about a middle name? I mean, if we don't have a son one day, can her middle name be Rolando? You know, I wanted to name a son Rolando after my father. And after all, that's my middle name, a family name. Javier rambled on as the carriage continued on their trek. Yes, Javi, she can be Rene Rolando Reyes, she said, smiling down at her daughter, who had closed her eyes to go back to sleep as the wagon continued into the night. Time quickly passed for the Reyes family in Cordoba, and just as quickly, Rene grew from infant to young child. Rene shot up in her bed in the corner of the house with a scream that lit every candle in their bedroom ablaze. Her parents awoke and ran to her side in fear for their daughter's safety. It was a nightmare again. So there's actually a space in this book, but I didn't pause long enough, just so you know. It's flash forward, I believe 5 years. It's been a little bit since I read this book, but and I know I wrote it, but it's flashed forward about 5 years since they came to Cordoba, and now Rene is getting older and she's having these dreams. It's a nightmare. Okay, 2.5 years had passed since Julia and Javier brought their daughter to Cordoba, 100 miles east of Puebla, to raise her in secret. The mention of divine powers that their new daughter would possess both troubled and intrigued their minds. So it was 2.5 years. But Rene ages fast, so Rene is actually 5. We'll get into that in a minute. Rene was an amazing sleeper as an infant. In fact, sleeping was never a problem for her until recently. Maybe it was because she grew and matured twice as fast as a normal child had been known to grow. Accelerated growth was one of the characteristics this divine being possessed. As many parents would attest to sleepless nights for their newborns and infants, that was not the case for Julia and Javier. Though they were conveniently located in a town where coffee was processed en masse, extra cups to energize them were never needed. But something was different now. This was the second time Rene had been jolted awake from a nightmare. The town was peaceful, and their home was fairly secluded on the outskirts. The house only had 2 rooms, a bedroom in one where the 3 of them slept, and the other was the common room with the kitchen and sitting area. The house had a large front patio, a small private courtyard protected by walls, a barn in the rear, and was surrounded by many trees. Javier and Julia found parenting agreeable and easy to be around each other so much. Javier had stopped traveling overseas too when the baby came. The two took turns visiting Puebla to check on things back in town where Maria was successfully managing things as she promised she could. Javier's brothers would sometimes bring Maria to visit Rene in Cordoba for holidays and at least once a month just for fun. Rene loved her visiting family just as much as her own parents. Everyone seemed happy and carefree, so what was going on to cause these nightmares? The biggest concern the two did have for their daughter up to this point was mostly, what is she going to do next? As Rene revealed her different gifts since they arrived at the old Feliz house. The first presented itself the moment they entered the dusty, old, abandoned-like casita. Rene sneezed, and the old candles sitting in the house all lit up. The two looked at each other and down at Rene, who was now awake, taking it all in. The second gift, aside from her accelerated growth and learning abilities, was she didn't mind heat. Meaning, when Rene was only 3 months old, she weaseled out of her mom's arms to crawl across the patio floor on a hot afternoon. Not even thinking the floor would be hot, the parents just observed her crawling away into the sunlit part of the patio. Dazzled by the red hairs that highlighted her head like a crown, they watched her find a leaf nearby. Rene was happily sitting on the ground in her diaper and small shirt, legs out in front and hands to her sides, supporting her off and on as she played. Javier headed towards her after a minute barefooted. Upon reaching the sunlit part of the patio, he exclaimed, "Ouch! It's hot!" Julia jumped into her sandals and ran to the baby, who was still laughing and smiling. She appeared to be studying her leaf. Javier forgot about his burning feet as he picked up Rene, checking her hands and legs for burns or red marks. "Is she okay?" Julia asked as she also inspected the baby in a frantic concern. "I guess so." Javier shrugged as he took her back into the shade. "My feet are probably blistered, but she is perfect as usual," he said in awe. "Okay, so our daughter seems to be fire resistant like the boys in the Bible? Wow," Julia said with sarcasm and confusion. "Divine powers," Angela told us, Javier recalled as he exhaled in relief. "What else can you do, mija? You are full of surprises," Julia questioned Rene, kissing her chubby cheek as Javier placed her in her mother's arms. Rene giggled. The parents wondered how this gift was going to support Rene's tasks ahead of her. However, these nightmares were unsettling for the parents. What was going on in Rene's mind? Maybe it was something we read to her that is getting in her mind, disrupting her sleep? But what? Javier asked, as Julia had picked up Rene to cry on her shoulder as she patted her back in an attempt to comfort her. "A train," Rene cried as she copied her mom and began to pat her back in return. Rene, who was only delivered a little over 2 years ago now, had the appearance of a 5-year-old girl. Accelerated growth. Rene pulled away from her mom and continued. "A train fell into the river and people died." "Who told you that, Rene?" Javier questioned, looking at Julia, who shook her head in response with a shrug. "In my dream, I saw it," Rene said, sniffling, sadly, looking down at her hands, almost in shame. Her parents just looked at her in concern, waiting for her to finish as her father moved the hair across her face behind her ear. Rene was very articulate, as she was also mature for her age. Her gift of accelerated learning, topped with the constant surrounding of only adults who would visit her at her home, aided in that development. Minus Tomas, who never seemed to grow up. He was Rene's best playtime partner when he came to town, a fun uncle who even played dolls with her. The train was on a bridge and it broke. There was a fire. she said, wringing her hands as if she was guilty. Did I do that? Rene asked quietly. Mija, no way. You were in bed here. You've never been on a train, Julia assured her daughter. But, Rene continued, she shuddered slightly. Rene, mi amor, yes, you do light candles here at home, but you are strong, he reminded her as he gently tapped her forehead with his finger. You can control it and get stronger every day. This was a dream, and you had nothing to do with it, okay? Javier explained. Rene nodded and began to relax slightly as her tears stopped. Okay, Papi, Rene replied in relief. I just felt like I was there, she said, exhausted as she placed her head back on her mother's shoulder. Julia held her for a moment and then placed her back down in bed. Dreams are like that, Nina. They seem real, I know, she told Rene as she rubbed her back. Yes, but what do I say to that hurt man who was walking to me? She shot up in bed again to add, worried. Ask him if he needs help. Don't be afraid. It's your dream, and maybe he needs help, her father suggested. We help people, remember? Javier finished as he stroked her cheek. Yeah, that's why we have Reina. You help that lady, Papi, Rene said with a yawn, laying back down. That's right, Julia added. Don't be afraid. You're brave, Nina. Okay, Mama, Rene replied as she settled down at last and closed her eyes. Julia and Javier kissed her head and headed back to bed, putting out the lit candles along the way. They lay down, wished each other good night, and sealed it with a kiss. The couple woke up early the next morning and sat outside to enjoy some coffee, watching the sun rise through the trees and listening to the birds playing. Reina was sitting in her cage on a nearby table, enjoying the birds in song. Julia and Javier did this often in order to share quality time alone together at home. Javier loved coffee, but Julia only drank it to commune with her husband before Rene woke up. The smell of coffee would always make Julia think of Javier when he was away on his trips, so having him home since the baby came was another great blessing. That dream must have really worn her out last night. She usually would be awake by now, Javier said as he leaned back into his chair to look at the open house door. I just hope she resolves her troubles. I hate getting nightmares myself. You're lucky you don't get any dreams too often, Julia commented with a shiver. True. I just wish I could sleep in general, as well as you two do. When the sun is up, I am up, he added as he took a drink of coffee. You make the best coffee, amor. I will never make it come out like you do, he finished as he took his wife's hand and kissed it. Speaking of coffee, we need more. Can you get more when you take the horses out for a ride today, please? Julia requested. Your wish is my command, corazon. I'll go now, actually. I feel it's going to be hot again today, he replied, kissed her, and headed for the small barn. He mounted the black Andalusian and leashed the second, a young brown-spotted horse, to follow beside him. Once across town, Javier laced the horse's leads to a post after a long trot and headed into a nearby market. As he kindly smiled and passed the merchant behind the counter, he noticed a newspaper article hanging behind her. Morelos Railway accident. 200 people dead. 40 injured. Train plummets from unsupported bridge into San Antonio River. Dated June 24th, 1881. Javier stopped in his tracks and leaned over the counter to read the article, his mouth open in shock. The merchant stood nearby, looking at him, slightly worried and irritated. Senor, that paper is old news. You didn't hear about it? She inquired as she looked at him concernedly. I may have been traveling overseas at the time. No, I didn't hear of it, Javier quickly replied to the cashier, looked over at her, and then down at the counter he was laying on to see the article. He quickly jumped off, his boots hitting the floor loudly, and stood as he adjusted his vest back into place, trying to wipe the look of shock off his face. "I'm sorry," he quickly apologized. "I didn't mean to jump on your counter. I don't get out of the house much to shop since my wife usually takes care of the shopping," he added in embarrassment. The merchant just shyly stared at Javier in a side glance, eyebrows raised for a minute, wondering what he may do next. "Can I get a pound of coffee, por favor? Sorry for the trouble," Javier quickly asked, eyes anxiously shifting around the store. The girl turned her body to reach for the sack of beans behind her, nervously, not taking her eyes off of Javier. "So you didn't lose a loved one in the wreck, I'm guessing, since you didn't hear about it?" she asked. "No, right. I did not. Did you?" Javier replied, still anxious. "Yes, he was my fiancé. We were to be married that August. He was a soldier," she recalled as she looked at the paper and back at Javier. "I'm so sorry to hear that. Sorry for your loss," Javier uttered solemnly as he handed her the money for the coffee. He then noticed a butterfly on her necklace and added, "That's a beautiful necklace," trying to change the subject with an optimistic smile while putting away his money clip. "Thank you," she said. "Juan gave it to me right after we met. He used to call me his butterfly. He was outgoing, and I'm the shy one," the girl responded as she gripped the charm on her necklace. Javier kicked himself on the inside and muttered under his breath, "Okay, big mouth, let's go." He thanked her for the coffee and apologized for any inconvenience he was causing and hurried out the door. As Javier returned home, housed the horses, and fed them in the barn, he could hear Rene laughing with her mother in the yard. He smiled at the thought of her feeling better since the nightmare, and headed into the courtyard. "Poppy!" Rene hollered as she ran with open arms to his. He bent over to hug her as he gently rocked her side to side in embrace. "Good morning, mi niña," Javier said lovingly. "You woke up late today." "I know," Rene confessed, "but I had to help that man," she added with a tone of determination. "The one in your dream? What did he say?" he asked anxiously, remembering the conversation in the store he just had. "Juan said, 'Tell my butterfly I love her and I miss her, but she has to let me go now,'" Rene said in dictation happily. Javier's jaw dropped. Unfazed by her father's demeanor, Rene added, "Poppy, I want a butterfly. I can never catch one. I will keep her forever." Rene then looked up to the sky with her arms open to twirl. Javier snapped out of it, shaking his head, and responded, "Oh, is that right? I'll work on that, okay? Let's go get Rene for now." He motioned toward the house. Julia, sensing something was wrong, mouthed, "What happened?" "I'll tell you later," he whispered as he handed her the bag of coffee. Early the next day, Julia headed for the market before it opened, careful to not let anyone see or notice what she was up to. She pulled a note from her bag and quickly slid it under the door and hustled back home. It read, "My beautiful mariposa, please stop hiding from your future. I love you and miss you, but you have to let me go. I want to see you happy again. Love, Juju." "My daughter is full of surprises," she reminded herself quietly as she arrived back home and opened the door. Javier and Rene looked up from their shared book on the table at Julia as she entered and smiled. "That part kind of makes me sad," That was a true event that actually happened. The Morelos Railway accident in 1881. I had to look up historical facts to incorporate into my book because my grandpa was a big reader and he actually would only read books on history and nonfiction, he said. So when I wrote this book, I had him in mind and thought, well, I would like it to be historical fiction at the same time. So it would be a book that he would want to read. But he was my grandpa, he probably would have read it anyway. Even though it's fiction, it's a fiction book, but see, there's some suspense to it, just like the reader said. And I really had to hold back crying. I get emo. But that was chapter 2. You can get the ebook again on Amazon, and I'm working on the audiobook. We are in April now, and it took me a little bit to get this second episode out, but thank you for watching, and thank you for being a part of this journey. I hope you enjoyed this chapter. Chapter 1 is already out on some earlier videos here on my YouTube channel. I hope you guys enjoy reading this book or listening to me read along with you. Bye-bye.